Tian Shan is one of the highest ranges on Earth. All these peaks are taller than the most lofty in the Alps. Few creatures can survive these icy wastes, but there are footprints in the high snows. We too have our legends of the Yeti or abominable snowman. We call him Снежный человек. Other creatures are less mythical, though almost as mysterious. The snow leopard. There are barely 2,000 of these great gray cats scattered through the Tian Shan and Pamir. They are solitary and elusive, very seldom seen. Each needs a huge tract of these barren mountains to support it. They prey on various creatures, but especially ibex, a kind of mountain goat. Though snow leopards are supposedly protected, a few are still killed by herdsmen defending their flocks. The ancestors of those flocks were animals like these. Several races of wild sheep range the mountains of Central Asia, from the low stony hills of the desert to the high peaks of the Pamir. We call these arhar. In spring, the snow melts first from the south-facing slopes, and it's here that the first fresh grass is found. In the cold light of a frosty April dawn, a flock of arhar gather at a salt lick. These are young rams, with a few young or barren females. The older males are in a separate flock, and so too are ewes with newborn lambs. The sexes mingle during the rut, but that won't be till December. Now in spring, the young rams are practicing for the more combative times that lie ahead. As the days get longer, the courtship whistles of snowcock echo from the cliffs. 5 kinds of these turkey-sized partridges are found in our mountains. These are Himalayan snowcock. They're called ular in Russian. Ular are birds of the high peaks. Never far from the snow line, they nest at up to 15,000 feet. And when other birds migrate to warmer climes, snowcocks stay in the mountains right through the bitter winter. Spring brings other animals into the open. As the snow retreats, marmots emerge from hibernation. These spaniel-sized rodents have passed the winter deep underground. Some spend an incredible 8 months of the year hibernating. Now they clear out their burrows, gather fresh bedding, and begin replacing the weight they've lost during their winter's sleep. Spring is also a time to renew social contacts. Other creatures emerge at this time of year. This poisonous viper is found in the Tian Shan as high as 10,000 feet. It's not unusual to see it crossing patches of snow, but only to get to the snow-free ground on the other side. Snowmelt waters a flush of spring flowers. Among the first to bloom are the wild tulips, in places as many as 20 different kinds. Wild pigs take advantage of the season's new growth. Over most of their range, they are forest animals. But here in the Tian Shan, they forage well up the mountain slopes, rooting for the bulbs of tulips and wild onions. By May, the sows have litters of stripy piglets. The Celestial Mountains are the realm of a special kind of bear. It's called the white-clawed bear, though in fact it's just a race of the brown bear that's found right across the northern hemisphere. As well as its pale claws, it's characterized by its pallid straw-colored fur. Bears too will have spent the winter sleeping. Now they too are replacing lost weight. The stalks of wild rhubarb make an astringent snack. For most of the year, bears are solitary. They only tolerate one another in spring. The cubs from this mating won't be born until Christmas, when the female is once more resting in her winter's den. Ibex follow the receding snow line up the slopes. these animals are males. As with wild sheep, the females and newborn kids are in a separate flock. Unlike the fast-running car, ibex never stray far from the safety of steep cliffs. They rely on their agility as climbers to elude wolves and snow leopards, and even bears. Bears are at least partly carnivorous. They dig marmots from their burrows, and they wouldn't refuse a young ibex if the chance arose. The bears are moving upwards too. They are powerful climbers and sometimes go as high as 12 or 14,000 feet. Glimpsed amongst the peaks or leaving their footprints in the high snows, they may be the origin of some of the stories about the Yeti. But there's little to interest a bear up here. Usually they cross high ridges just to get to the other side, where there's more to eat. The high valleys of the Tian Shan are home to one of our rarest and strangest birds. It's found only where the rivers are broad and shingly, rather than rocky and torrential. It's the ibisbill. The long curved beak that gives it its name is ideally suited to probing for food amongst rounded water-worn pebbles. Ibisbills start breeding as early as April, often when there is still snow on the ground. They lay their eggs in a simple scrape in the shingle. There are only some 150 pairs in the mountains that fringe our border with China. While the ibisbills are incubating, birds that breed at lower levels will already have hatched their eggs. One of the most exotic nests in riverine forests at the foot of the Celestial Mountains. Its strongholds are far to the south, in India. It's one of the creatures that have overcome the mountain barrier. The paradise flycatcher. Here it mingles with species from the steppes and Siberia. The Persian robin is another that makes the Tian Shan a meeting place for birds from the tropics and the cold lands to the north. Higher up the mountain, there's yet another link with India, the Himalayan ruby-throat. It's an insect eater. The big Apollo butterflies that characterize these alpine meadows provide food for its young, concealed beneath a juniper. The same junipers play host to the white-winged grosbeak. Grosbeaks are seed-eaters. The huge beak that gives them their name is well suited to husking juniper berries. By June, the ibisbill's eggs are hatching. The chicks are well camouflaged, but even so, they can still attract the attention of predators. The white insides of broken eggshells are conspicuous, so as each chick hatches, the parents remove the telltale debris. The chicks will leave the nest soon after they hatch, but they depend on their parents for warmth and shelter, and for much of their food. It will be some weeks before their beaks grow long enough to probe beneath the stones. The high valleys where the ibis bills nest may be remote, but not all are deserted. Nomad encampments dot the landscape as they have for centuries. And Kyrgyz horsemen still tend their herds of yaks. The yak is a kind of high-altitude cow. It comes originally from Tibet and the Himalayas. Indeed, yak is a Tibetan word. Here in the mountains of Kyrgyzia, it's at the northern limits of its range. Few truly wild yaks are left. Most, like these, are domesticated, but they still retain all the traits of their wild ancestors. Their long skirt of hair keeps them well insulated. They are ideally suited to these elevated pastures, where no ordinary cow could survive the frigid winters. Yaks are still wild in temperament. Some of these have had their horns removed to make them less dangerous. This herd is kept mainly for its meat, but over most of their range, they are used as beasts of burden and exploited for their hair and their milk. Like many hoofed animals, they enjoy a roll in the dust. September is the time of the rat. Bulls test the cows to see if they are receptive. And just as they would in the wild, solitary bulls hang around on the edge of the herd, waiting to challenge the resident males and acquire the right to mate. Yaks can remain high on the mountain right through the winter, but that's not the case with other domestic animals. Sheep aren't as hardy as their wild ancestors. They are taken up the mountains in spring, but in the end of summer, they must be driven down to kinder elevations. Here in Central Asia, these seasonal movements of people and their livestock are little changed from the times of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. In summer, the traditional yurt is still the preferred habitation, a tent of white felt stretched over a wooden frame and furnished with cushions and rugs. Semi-nomadic peoples in these remote mountains are dependent on their flocks and herds for food even today. Kyrgyz children are taught to ride almost before they can walk. If there's an animal that's played a more vital role in this people's history than any other, it's the horse. It was the horse that enabled Genghis Khan to thunder out of Mongolia in the 13th century, to conquer an empire that stretched from China in the east to Poland and Hungary in the west. Warriors on horseback were to terrorize Eastern Europe for the next 300 years. Today, these descendants of the Mongol hordes still keep horses, but for more peaceable purposes, for their meat and for their milk. The foal is put to its mother's udder to start the milk flowing. Then it's pulled away, but it's held where the mother can see it to maintain the flow. The milk is fermented to make kumis, a thin, smoky, fizzy yogurt that's been a mainstay of the Mongol diet for centuries. It refreshed the warriors of the Golden Horde, and Marco Polo drank it at the court of Kublai Khan. The icy summits of the Celestial Mountains are the only high peaks in Central Asia. To the southwest of the Tian Shan, there is an even higher range of mountains. The Pamir, on the borders of China and Tajikistan. The western Pamir is steep and jagged, but eastwards, towards Xinjiang, the landscape changes. It's a high, dry plateau, broken by one great sheet of water, Lake Karakum, the Black Lake. Raised beaches along the shore show the water level was once much higher. Today, the lake has no outlet, and its waters are saline. Those white beaches aren't sand, they are salt. Karakum lies at over 13,000 feet, and it's frozen for 7 months of the year. But despite that, it's not devoid of life. Brown-headed gulls. They're rather like the familiar black-headed gull, but bigger. It's one of our rarest birds. There are only a few hundred pairs, and they nest only here and a handful of other lakes in the Pamir. There's just a sparse growth of weed in the cold, clear waters of the lake, but it's enough to support one kind of weed-eating fish. That in turn provides food for the gulls and their chicks. By July, the chicks are well grown, but they are still dependent on their parents for food. Begging for food is a normal part of the courtship ritual, but this female seems to be competing with her own chick. One of the other birds that nest here makes what must be one of the most remarkable journeys in the animal kingdom. The bar-headed goose. It winters on the plains of northern India, and each spring it cuts through the Himalayan barrier, threading its way through high glaciated valleys to reach its nesting grounds. These geese hold what is surely the altitude record for migrating birds. Many years ago, an astronomer in northern India was photographing the moon. When he developed the prints, one showed a skein of geese silhouetted against the moon's disk. From their size, he calculated that they must have been flying at 29,000 feet. That's almost the height of Everest. Barheads breed in what must be some of the most remote and desolate places on Earth. Most nest on soda lakes on the Tibetan plateau, but a few travel on north and west to the Tian Shan and Pamir. Some 200 pairs nest on Karakur. Another 50 or so come here to Lake Rangkur, a shallow salt lake hard by the border with Xinjiang. Almost no rain falls here, and even in winter there's little snow. The lake's surroundings are a high, dry desert. The geese arrive in late May, when the lake is still frozen. They settle on barren, salty islands. The female digs a hollow in the caustic soil and lines it with down from her breast. In this simple nest, she lays between 2 and 5 eggs. It will take them nearly a month to hatch. She shoulders the burden of all the incubating, but while she sits, her mate stands guard. Though nesting on islands keeps wolves and foxes at bay, there are other dangers. Ravens. When the first clutches hatch, a few adult eggs are left in the abandoned nests. These attract scavengers from the surrounding mountains. But given the chance, ravens take eggs from any unguarded nest. Most eggs do hatch safely. The chicks remain on the nest for a day. Then their mother calls them down to the water. Rangkul is very shallow. Much of the lake is only 3 to 6 feet deep. In summer, its corrosive waters warm rapidly, and there are prolific hatches of midges, full of protein for the growing goslings. These high soda lakes have much in common with the Arctic tundra. Just as some birds fly north to exploit the brief seasonal flush of food, so others come here. Mongolian plover forage on the shore, and citrine wagtails that winter in southern Asia nest in the narrow strips of marsh that surround the lake. Away from the lake, water is scarce. There's the occasional stream to support moisture-loving plants such as primulas. But most of this land is a high, dry desert. Out there, plants have to contend with very different conditions. They are frozen by night, baked by day, blasted by the cold and gritty wind. Most grow as low mats or cushions, clinging close to the ground for shelter. You might think that no animal could survive in this desolate moonscape. But there is life here. Marmots. This is the red marmot, one of 3 kinds in the mountains of Central Asia. Marmots live as high as 16,000 feet. That's higher than any mountain in Europe. Each extended family has a central complex of burrows that can be 12 feet deep. It's here they spend most of their life. For barely 4 months each year, the ground is free of snow, and there is a scattering of fresh green growth for the marmots to graze. Then, when the vegetation begins to dry out in late summer, the marmots disappear underground again to hibernate until the next spring. Up to 10 animals live in each colony, but there's only one breeding pair. The rest are young from previous years. Marmots are territorial. The male marks the group's range with scent glands on his cheeks and chest, and also with piles of dung. The territory is perhaps 5 acres in extent. Apart from the central burrows, there are shallow bolt holes around the edge, where the marmots can take refuge. This is the mother. Her young will have been born early in May, but they don't show themselves above ground until they're more than a month old. Baby red marmots are gray. They won't acquire the foxy red fur of their parents until the end of their first summer. There are 3 or 4 young to a litter, and they are very playful. A break from motherhood to bask in the sun. The infants will still be suckling, but they are beginning to experiment with solid food. And they are starting to explore away from the burrow. It's at this stage of life that they are most vulnerable. For young marmots, foxes are the major threat. Eagles take young and adults, and a few fall victim to bears digging out their burrows. But their greatest predators are people. Marmots are hunted for their fat, which has medicinal properties, and they make good fur hats. On the southwestern edge of the Pamir, there lives one of the rarest animals in the country, more scarce even than the snow leopard. It's the markhur. The name means snake eater in Tajik. Russians call it vintorogi kozel, the screw-horn goat. There are barely 600 markhur in Tajikistan, and not many more over the borders in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's early December, the time of the rat. The spiral-horned males are pursuing the smaller females. Most of the year, markhur stay below the snow line. Higher up, the pigs are already in the grip of winter. The mountains may be cold, but they are not deserted. Marco Polo sheep, the largest of the wild sheep. These giant sheep stay up at 12 to 14,000 feet right through the winter. Although the cold is bitter, here in the eastern Pamir, there is only a thin covering of snow, little enough for the sheep to scrape away to find food. Yaks remain up in the mountains too. Some of the yak herders stay with them, not to feed their animals, but to defend them against wolves and perhaps snow leopards. Even the hardy cat of the high snows moves down towards the tree line in the depths of winter. There's little for it to eat up here. The very highest peaks are left cold, silent, and deserted. We leave the mountains in the very center of the Pamir, beside the 50-mile length of the Fetchenko Glacier. Here rises the greatest mountain of all, known in Soviet times as Peak Communism. At 24,617 feet, this is the highest citadel in the realms of the Russian bear.